In an exhibition that opened in mid-October and closes today, the Morgan Library focuses on the essential role of women in ancient Mesopotamia. As the waters began to recede in the 4th century BCE from the floodplains of present-day Iraq, cities began to develop across the region. The cylinder seals, poems, and other texts that have been discovered from that era bear testament to women's religious roles as goddesses, priestesses, and worshipers, as well as their social, economic, and political roles. Writing was invented during the same period, which enabled people to communicate across distances, speeded the exchange of culture, and helped people keep track of the flow of goods. By late in the 3rd century BCE, a Mesopotamian ruler named Sargon united some 65 cities across the region to form history's first empire, which extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Ruling from the northern city of Acadia, Sargon's challenge was to unite the disparate religious and other cultural customs of his empire. He dispatched his daughter Enheduanna as his emissary to the south, hoping her presence would help unify the peoples of the new empire. Enheduanna became the high priestess in the temple of the goddess Inanna, goddess of love, beauty, war, and fertility, in the southern city of Ur. In that role, Enheduanna wrote poems for use as temple hymns to serve as common religious practices across the kingdom. The texts she wrote were used for hundreds of years in schools to teach the people how to write. When Sargon died, the kingdom fell into disarray, and a military general named Galen fomented a revolt against Enheduanna and drove her out of the temple. In one of her poems, Enheduanna describes Galen's desecration of the temple and his apparent sexual assault of her. He has turned that temple into a house of ill repute, she writes, forcing his way in as if he were an equal. He dared approach me in his lust. After Galen's assault, he forced Enheduanna out of the city into the wilderness, giving her a dagger and suggesting she use it to commit suicide. She writes, "He made me walk a land of thorns. He took away the noble diadem of my holy office. He gave me a dagger. This is just right for you," he said. Until the city of Ur was excavated about a century ago, the writings of Enheduanna and other Mesopotamian women were covered over by the sands of time. After the writings were discovered, a fierce debate raged over whether Enheduanna, a woman, could possibly have been history's first named author. Until recently, if you ask the identity of history's first named author, the answer probably would have been Homer. Homer's Iliad, one of the most influential stories in all Western literature, was composed nearly 3,000 years ago, 1,000 years after Enheduanna. The Iliad and its sequel, the Odyssey, were epic in length, encyclopedic in scope, and wildly popular. The books cover the roughly 10-year battle between the Greeks and the Trojans. In Stephen Mitchell's superb translation of the Iliad, the story opens with these words: "The rage of Achilles, sing it now, goddess, sing through me the deadly rage that caused the Achaeans such grief, and hurled down to Hades the souls of so many fighters, leaving their naked flesh to be eaten by dogs and carrion birds, as the will of Zeus was accomplished. The very first word of the Iliad is the Greek word menon, which means rage. What was the Greek military champion Achilles enraged about? He became enraged, Homer explains, when Achilles' share of war plunder, a young maiden named Briseis, was taken from him by the Greek commander Agamemnon. From the outset, Homer assumes that it's the prerogative of Achilles and Agamemnon, their privilege as males, to fight over sexual possession of Briseis. Which man she may have wanted, if indeed she wanted either of them, isn't part of the story. Neither is her own rage, which must have fully equaled the rage of Achilles, and which Homer doesn't even bother to mention or wonder about. As you doubtless know, the Greeks headed for Troy in the first place because two different men were fighting over a different woman. A Trojan warrior named Paris stole the wife of the Greek king Menelaus. Her name was Helen, and she was reputedly the most beautiful woman in the world, the face that launched 1,000 ships, as the idiom goes. In response to the theft, a flotilla of Greek ships filled with warriors sailed to Troy to reclaim Helen and destroy the city. While Helen and Briseis appear to have suffered similar traumas to those suffered by Enheduanna, we don't have their firsthand accounts of what they experienced and how they felt and what it did to their lives. Increasingly, however, the historically persistent and culturally pervasive practice of men discounting women's stories and denying women's suffering has begun to recede. Women are increasingly able to channel Enheduanna by telling their stories and giving voice to their suffering. In this way, Enheduanna's primordial anger lives on. You can hear its echoes, for example, in Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which was first published 60 years ago today. An instant bestseller, the book initially sold over 1 million copies and sparked second-wave feminism in the United States. Friedan's premise, observed Diane Johnson in the New York Review of Books in the 60s, was that women were really people, no more, no less. And her conclusion was that all the things that kept them from being full people in our society would have to be changed. You can also hear echoes of Enheduanna's anger in Beyoncé's 2016 album titled Lemonade. One of the world's best-selling performers, Beyoncé's records have sold more than 200 million copies worldwide. Earlier this month, she received her 32nd Grammy Award, more than any other artist in the history of the awards. The through line of her album, Lemonade, is the sexual infidelity of her then husband, the hip-hop mogul Jay-Z. To my knowledge, Beyoncé has never publicly stated that Jay-Z abused her physically, though physical violence permeated Jay-Z's life growing up and saturates his lyrics as a rapper. Beyoncé's opening fusillade against Jay-Z's betrayal, to which he subsequently confessed, comes in the form of a tauntingly angry song titled, "Pray You Catch Me." Beyoncé writes and sings, "You can taste the dishonesty, it's all over your breath. as you pass it off so cavalier, but even that's a test. Constantly aware of it all, my lonely ear pressed against the walls of your world. Pray to catch you whispering. I pray you catch me listening. In the wake of this devastating betrayal, Beyoncé writes of the walls Jay-Z has built around him. But the walls don't keep her fully out. Her lonely ear remains pressed against them. Among other things, she hears the truth about his dishonesty. Even so, the last two lines, the chorus, seem tragically hopeful. A prayer that she will find him whispering to her from the other side, and he will find her listening. No such whispering and listening apparently happened because Beyoncé and Jay-Z soon thereafter went their separate ways. But that's the hope. When people are suffering, and especially when they cry out in pain, they hope against hope that someone will be listening. Last Tuesday, a reporter for the hard-right media outlet Newsmax asked White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre if President Biden was woke. Instead of Jean-Pierre giving the non-answer that she eventually got around to giving, she should have consulted the comedian Sarah Silverman, who later answered the question as guest host of The Daily Show. What I know woke to mean, Silverman said, is learning new things about people or the world and then acting accordingly, like basic kindness, maybe a gesture of care to people who are more vulnerable than you. In order to awaken fully to life, we need to learn some things about the people and world around us, and then act accordingly, act with care. In Frank Brunei's most recent book titled The Beauty of Dusk, on vision lost and found, he describes his own awakening to others following a rare stroke that affected his optic nerve, leaving him functionally blind in one eye and threatening the vision of the other. He writes, "With my one good eye, I looked harder and longer and, I hope, more soulfully at everything around me, starting with my acquaintances and friends. I realized that we know too little about the people in our lives because we inspect them only superficially, ask the easy and polite questions, edit them down to the parts that give us the least complicated and most immediate pleasure. There's heartache in them that we don't adequately recognize, triumph in them that we don't sufficiently venerate. On the morning after my stroke, I awoke to that as well." We need a greater awakening to the truth about the people and world around us, and then we need to act accordingly. We need to give a place of prominence to the stories of people whom the dominant patriarchal and racist culture has walled off or otherwise suppressed or disregarded: women, people of color, LGBTQ+ people, and economically marginalized people. Those of us who are in positions of relative power and influence need to open more fully our ears and eyes and hearts to the experience of others. We need to listen to those who are suffering. We need to learn new things and act accordingly. In the ancient city of Ur, the rebellion of Lugalon was eventually put down by Enheduanna's nephew, and she was restored to her position in the city and in the temple. In a poem about the experience, Enheduanna gives credit to the goddess Inanna, but other sources indicate that Enheduanna's own rhetorical and political influence played a role as well. She writes, speaking to the goddess, "O my lady, beloved of heaven, I have told your fury truly. Now that her priestess has returned to her place, Inanna's heart is restored. The day is auspicious. The priestess is clothed in beautiful robes in womanly beauty, as if in the light of the rising moon. The gods have appeared in their rightful places. The doorsill of heaven cries, 'Hail!' Praise to the destroyer endowed with power, to my lady enfolded in beauty." Sometimes when sufferers cry out, someone is listening and responds. Sometimes righteous fury is necessary, especially when confronting egregious wrongs. Sometimes justice prevails and healing happens. Then the day becomes auspicious, perhaps even enfolded in beauty. To those among us and around us who today find themselves suffering from the cruelty or indifference of others, I pray they catch us listening. Amen. I love you. May God bless us all.